He was the man everyone trusted, a friendly neighbor, a volunteer, a clown who made children laugh at birthday parties, but beneath his home, he wasn't burying memories. He was burying bodies. How did a man who brought smiles to children's faces become one of the most terrifying killers in American history? This is the true story of John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown who hid his nightmares beneath the floorboards. There's a certain comfort in believing that monsters look like monsters, that evil has a shape, a smell, a warning. But sometimes it wears a smile and walks among us unnoticed. In the early 1970s, the Chicago suburb of Norwood Park was the kind of place people described as safe. The streets were lined with tidy homes, trimmed lawns, and families who waved to each other on Sunday mornings. Life was predictable there, ordinary. And in one of those houses, a modest ranch-style home on West Somerdale Avenue, lived a man who seemed to fit right in. His name was John Wayne Gacy. He hosted summer barbecues, volunteered for community events, and even dressed as a clown for children's hospitals. Pogo the Clown, he called himself, a man who made kids laugh, painted faces, and lifted spirits. He was the kind of neighbor people trusted, the kind of man parents never feared. He was always busy, always helping. He ran a small contracting company, PDM Contractors, and hired young men in the neighborhood who needed work. To many, Gacy was the image of a hard-working, generous citizen, the American dream in a red and white clown suit. But the air around him carried a quiet unease, the kind you can't name until it's too late. Neighbors sometimes complained of a strange odor coming from the crawl space beneath his house. He always had an excuse. Just the plumbing, he'd say, waving it off with a chuckle. And because he smiled when he said it, because he was one of them, they believed him. In Norwood Park, people believed what they wanted to believe. Gacy's story didn't begin with a mask. It began with a boy who learned early how to wear one. He was born in 1942 in another Chicago neighborhood to a family that looked respectable from the outside. But inside that home was cruelty, a father whose hands were as quick with a belt as his mouth was with insults, a father who called him weak, soft, worthless, a boy who wanted love and received humiliation instead. He learned early that the world rewarded performance, that if you smiled wide enough, people stopped asking questions. And John Wayne Gacy would spend the rest of his life mastering that performance. By the time he reached adulthood, he built himself into someone new, a man who knew how to charm, how to impress, how to hide behind laughter. He joined community clubs, political campaigns, even became vice president of the local JCs, a civic group dedicated to leadership and service. He shook hands with officials, took pictures with children, and hid every dark thought behind a grin. But beneath the surface, something was shifting, a storm of resentment and desire for control. The line between who he was and who he pretended to be began to blur. There were whispers even then, odd comments, strange behaviors. Some people noticed he was too friendly with young men, that his jokes were too crude. But in the 1960s Midwest, respectability was its own kind of armor. Who would accuse the smiling businessman, the clown, the volunteer? When he was first arrested in 1968 for an offense involving a teenage boy, it barely made headlines. He served just a year and a half before walking free, and when he returned to Chicago, people welcomed him back without question. Forgiveness, they said. Second chances. No one wondered what kind of man returns from prison and slips so easily back into the community's good graces. No one looked close enough. By the mid-1970s, his life looked picture-perfect again. He'd built his contracting business from scratch, bought a home, and even had a collection of photographs with local politicians, including the First Lady. People said he was the kind of man who got things done. Reliable. A symbol of trust. And trust, in his hands, was a weapon sharper than any knife. The young men he hired often came from rough homes, broken families, or the edges of poverty. They saw in him a mentor, a man offering work and stability. He called them his boys. He joked, offered them drinks, and promised opportunity. And behind every laugh was a quiet calculation. But no one in Norwood Park saw that side of him. They saw the clown costume. They saw the red nose and the painted smile. They saw the parties and the parades. And they didn't see the shadows stretching beneath the floorboards of his home. Evil doesn't always hide in darkness. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, and society, too eager to believe in good, refuses to see it. That blindness, that trust, became the perfect camouflage. The first to vanish barely caused a ripple. A runaway, people said. Drifter. A boy who probably left town to chase something bigger. And another. And another. Names fading into the wind, unconnected, unnoticed. The world above went on, barbecues, fundraisers, laughter. And under the house, the air grew heavier, the soil thicker, the mask tighter. If anyone had looked closer, really looked, they might have seen it in his eyes. The way the smile never reached them. The way his laughter sounded just a second too forced. But people rarely look for monsters in those who make them feel safe. For 6 years, the clown entertained, the contractor built, and the neighbors smiled. And somewhere beneath his house, a hidden world grew, a silent reminder of everything society refused to see. In December 1978, that silence began to crack. A boy named Robert Piest, 15 years old, vanished after leaving work to speak with a man about a construction job. He told his mother, "I'll be right back." He never returned. This time, people noticed. Because when innocence disappears in plain sight, even the blind begin to squint toward the truth. And beneath one quiet house in Norwood Park, the truth was waiting, cold, patient, and buried in layers of denial. The night had a strange stillness about it, the kind that hums beneath ordinary noise. Chicago's northwestern suburbs were winding down for winter in the mid-1970s. Streetlights flickering, snow softening the sound of passing cars, families shutting blinds against the cold. And behind one of those drawn curtains, John Wayne Gacy was mastering the art of contradiction. By day, he was busier than ever. Contracts piled high, business expanding, his name printed on neighborhood flyers and campaign lists. He attended fundraisers in press suits, posed for photographs with officials, handed out handshakes that felt like promises. He had perfected the image of success, a man who had rebuilt himself from a mistake and now stood as proof of second chances. No one questioned where the money came from or why so many young employees drifted in and out of his orbit without a word goodbye. He moved through people's lives the way a shadow passes over a wall, seen but never noticed. Neighbors saw him mowing his lawn, hosting parties, and assumed that was all there was to know. They did not hear the silence that followed some of those boys home, because none of them ever made it there. Inside, Gacy's world was shrinking. The crawl space under his house had become a place of secrets, dark, airless, and heavy. He told himself he was still in control, that no one would ever discover what lived beneath him. Control was his language now. He spoke it fluently, in every smile, every command, every lie told with unblinking confidence. There were nights when he painted the face of Pogo the clown, red and white and blue. He said it was to bring joy, to lift spirits. But the paint became a ritual, a mask layered over a man who could not bear to meet his own reflection. Each brushstroke buried the boy his father once beat into silence. Each laugh drowned out the guilt that clawed at the edges of his mind. People praised him for his community spirit. They applauded when he visited hospitals dressed as a clown. They elected him precinct captain in his local Democratic Party chapter. No one asked why he always seemed surrounded by young men who came and went like ghosts. When parents wondered where their sons had gone, police filed thin reports and thinner hope. Runaways, they said. It was the 1970s. Kids disappeared all the time. It was easier to believe they'd left by choice than to imagine what else could happen in a quiet house 2 blocks away. Yet whispers persisted. One employee accused him of assault and vanished. Another quit abruptly after something he didn't want to talk about. Still, Gacy's reputation held. He donated to local causes, spoke at meetings, showed up for photo ops. When complaints surfaced, he brushed them off with the same disarming charm. Just kids making trouble, he'd laugh. And because the man laughing wore a suit and a smile, people accepted the answer. Society has a way of defending its illusions. It would rather protect the image of goodness than confront the possibility of evil in plain clothes. Gacy understood that. He used it. He knew that if he acted the part of the good man loudly enough, the silence of the missing would be drowned out by applause. But inside him, something began to fracture. He drank more, slept less, felt the walls closing in. He told acquaintances about a drainage problem under the house, about the smell that never quite went away. He joked that it was just dead mice. People laughed. They always laughed. The duality consumed him. Pogo the clown on weekends, the respected businessman during the week, and something nameless in between. He could charm an entire room, then drive home through the darkness replaying his father's voice in his head, "You're worthless. You'll never be a man." Each act of violence seemed, to him, a twisted act of reclamation, a way to silence that voice once and for all. Still, he smiled in photographs. He smiled when city officials called him dependable. He smiled when reporters took his picture, shaking hands with the First Lady. It was the smile of a man who believed he had mastered invisibility. By 1977, the ground beneath his home was no longer enough. There were too many secrets, too little space. He began driving to the river at night, disposing of what could no longer be hidden. He told himself it was necessary, just part of maintaining the illusion. He told himself the world would never know. And for a while, he was right. Until December 1978, when a small-town hardware store became the stage for his undoing. That evening, Robert Piest, 15, told his mother he was stepping outside to talk to a contractor about a part-time job. The man's name was John Gacy. He promised good pay, easy hours, just enough to sound believable. Robert smiled, said he'd be right back, and disappeared into the cold night air. This time, the void he left behind didn't fade quietly. His mother called the police within hours, insisting that her son wasn't a runaway. He was responsible, thoughtful, the kind of boy who called home if he'd be late. Detectives began to trace Robert's last steps. The name Gacy came up quickly, again and again, whispered by coworkers who'd heard his promise of construction jobs. When officers first knocked on Gacy's door, he greeted them warmly. He joked, offered coffee, mentioned his community service. But beneath the charm, detectives sensed an edge, something rehearsed, controlled. He denied knowing the boy, denied everything. Yet as they left, one officer glanced toward the crawl space door, catching a whiff of something foul beneath the hum of the furnace. They wrote it off at first. Just the plumbing, maybe. It always was. But the name wouldn't leave them. When they checked his record, they found the old conviction from Iowa. The mask began to slip. Surveillance followed, days of quiet observation, nights of waiting outside his home as snow fell across the empty street. Gacy seemed calm at first, almost amused by the attention. He'd wave to officers, bring them coffee, try to win them over like everyone else. But the pressure grew, the cracks widened. He stopped sleeping. He drank heavily. In conversations, he began to talk about things you can't imagine, about mistakes buried too deep. The officers listened, half believing he was just trying to scare them. Then, one night, during a casual conversation in his car, John Wayne Gacy muttered words that froze the air. He said, "You know, a clown can get away with murder." He laughed afterward, a thin, nervous sound, but the officers didn't laugh with him. The surveillance team tightened its watch. A second warrant was issued. When police entered his house again, they began to peel back years of lies. They found a high school ring, driver's licenses that didn't belong to him, clothing that didn't fit his size. And beneath the floorboards, the earth waited. By the time they realized what they were standing on, the illusion of normalcy had already crumbled. The clown, the neighbor, the volunteer, each identity dissolved into something raw and monstrous. For years, society had clapped for his performances, admired his charity, trusted his smile. Now, it would have to face the truth it had ignored. That evil had been living next door, and it had been wearing a painted grin. The descent was complete. The next sound would not be laughter, but the echo of shovels breaking soil. For years, the quiet suburb of Norwood Park had slept soundly under the illusion that monsters were born elsewhere. That evil had a look, a smell, a warning label. It wasn't supposed to wear a painted smile and hand out balloons at children's parties. But on a cold night in December 1978, illusion began to crack. They found small clues at first, a class ring belonging to a missing boy, driver's licenses that didn't belong to him, handcuffs and photographs. Ordinary objects with extraordinary implications. But none of them prepared the detectives for what lay beneath the house. In the crawl space under Gacy's home, beneath layers of earth and rot, they found what the world had refused to see. The faces behind the missing posters, the sons who never came home, the truth society had buried alongside them. One detective later said that moment didn't feel like discovery. It felt like judgment, a reckoning for everyone who had looked away. The suburban dream shattered overnight. The community that once saw Gacy as a leader now stared at his house as if it were breathing. The police lights turned a neighborhood into a silent confession booth. Reporters gathered, families wept, and a nation asked the same question: how could this happen? But the truth was, it hadn't just happened. It had been happening for years, quietly, efficiently, beneath layers of laughter and normalcy. Every small complaint, every rumor brushed aside, every parent told not to worry, each act of denial became a brick in the wall that hid Gacy's crimes. When Gacy was finally confronted, his charm broke. The rehearsed lines, the friendly laugh, all gone. What replaced them was a strange kind of arrogance, a man who had lived so long inside his own mythology that he couldn't grasp the enormity of his actions. He blamed others, fate, circumstance, anyone but himself. During his confession, Gacy spoke with the same calm tone he'd used when entertaining children as Pogo the Clown. He talked about death the way most men talk about business. It wasn't rage that defined him. It was detachment. And in that detachment, the true horror lived. When investigators finished digging, they recovered 29 bodies beneath and around his home. For more were found in nearby rivers. Each discovery felt like another ghost stepping into the light, demanding to be seen. As word spread, America stared into the mirror and didn't like what it saw. Because the question was no longer, who is John Wayne Gacy? But how many more do we not see? The friendly neighbor, the youth volunteer, the man who smiles too easily. In the end, Gacy became something larger than himself, a symbol of our blindness, our need to believe that evil looks like a monster, not a man in a clown suit. And as the police escorted him out in handcuffs, cameras flashing, he turned to the crowd and smiled. It wasn't remorse. It was recognition that he had fooled them all. The mask was gone, but the performance wasn't over. Because even after his house was torn down, after the trial began, after the world learned his name, people still argue that he didn't seem the type. And that's the chilling truth. He wasn't the type. That's why it worked. When the mask finally fell, it didn't make a sound. The laughter stopped, the neighbors fell silent, and America stood face to face with its own reflection. The smiling man next door, the volunteer, the clown. Evil, it seemed, didn't come from the shadows. It came from the spotlight. In the months that followed John Wayne Gacy's arrest, the world tried to make sense of what he'd done. Prosecutors built their case meticulously, piece by piece, bone by bone, while psychologists searched for the human beneath the horror and found almost nothing. Gacy's trial began in 1980. He sat there, calm and collected, wearing a suit that made him look like any ordinary man. That was the unsettling part, the ordinariness. He laughed at times, joked with his lawyers, even sketched drawings of himself as a clown to pass the time. He seemed more performer than defendant, still clinging to the illusion that charm could save him. But behind the courtroom glass sat rows of broken families, each face carrying the weight of someone who never came home. Each testimony painted a clearer picture, not just of Gacy's crimes, but the indifference that had allowed them to thrive. Neighbors who ignored the smell. Police who didn't follow up. A system that let a convicted offender reinvent himself as a community man. The jurors didn't deliberate long. After 5 weeks of testimony, they found John Wayne Gacy guilty of 33 murders, the largest known case of serial homicide in American history at that time. He was sentenced to death. But even as he awaited execution, Gacy became something strange, a celebrity of evil. He gave interviews, sold paintings of his clown persona, and spoke with an eerie calm, as if his life and crimes were a marketing campaign for himself. When asked if he felt remorse, he said, "I'm not the monster society makes me out to be." And maybe that was true, not because he was innocent, but because the real monster was bigger than him. It was the blindness of a world that let a man hide in plain sight. The years passed slowly on death row. Gacy painted clowns, landscapes, and self-portraits that sold for thousands. Some buyers said they wanted to own a piece of evil. Others claimed they wanted to understand it. But what is there to understand a man who represents not rage, but absence, the total absence of empathy, of conscience, of light? In May 1994, after 14 years on death row, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. When asked for his final words, he looked at the witnesses and said, "Kiss my ass." Even at the end, he refused reflection. He left that work to the living. After his death, the house was demolished. Every brick, every nail, every inch of soil replaced. But the ground itself seemed scarred. Locals said the air there still felt heavy, like memory had weight, and in a way it did. Because what happened under that house was not just Gacy's doing. It was the result of a world too polite to confront darkness when it smiles. Parents trusted. Neighbors excused. Police hesitated. Society looked away. It's comforting to call Gacy a monster. It gives us distance, a way to say, he was nothing like us. But the truth is, monsters like him don't appear out of nowhere. They grow in the silence of our disbelief, in the gaps between what we see and what we're willing to acknowledge. The moral blindness that protected Gacy is the same blindness that still lives quietly today, in neighborhoods, in institutions, in the people we assume are good simply because they look the part. There's a chilling irony in Gacy's story. He spent years dressing as a clown, a symbol of joy, laughter, innocence. The costume became a prophecy. Because behind every painted smile lies the same truth. People see only what they want to. And maybe that's the real horror, not what Gacy did, but what we didn't do. The story of John Wayne Gacy isn't just about a killer. It's about how easily evil can blend into the background when society prefers comfort over confrontation. How warnings are ignored because they disturb the peace. How people disappear, not only from the world, but from memory, when we choose not to see them. Gacy's legacy is a reminder that vigilance isn't paranoia. Awareness isn't fear. Because the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark. They're the ones standing in the light, smiling, shaking hands, and asking for your trust. If this story resonates with you, share it. Not for the fear, but for the truth it carries. That evil doesn't always look evil. Sometimes it looks familiar. And if you want to uncover more hidden truths, more stories that remind us what humanity forgets, subscribe, stay curious, and never stop questioning what lies behind the mask.